Hello, everybody. My name is John Chunky, and I feel very privileged to be invited to chair this evening's session on tech transparency, understanding online extremism. It's been a fantastic day today, and I've been so impressed by the quality and breadth of the presentations. And I'm really excited about this evening's presentations because this is an area about which I know very little. Before our speakers begin, I'd like to remind you to forward any questions via the Zoom Q&A function so that I can put them to Erin and Lydia after they've both delivered their presentations. So our first presentation this evening is by Dr. Erin Saltman from the Global Internet Counterterrorism Forum. And a reminder that Erin's and the other speakers' biographies are available in the Symposium program. Now, Erin's presentation is titled Frameworks for Pursuing Greater Transparency, the Global Internet Counterterrorism Forum's Transparency Working Group. So over to you, Erin.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The caffeine is just kicking in. It's 7:01 in the morning here in London, and it's a pleasure to be joining you. And so I just want to start by saying it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to different people around the world about how different sectors are approaching the concept of transparency. So it's often something that civil society organizations and NGOs and human rights activists in particular constantly point out for governments, for tech companies, and at the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism. Normally, an NGO is not held to such a high standard to try to develop its own transparency and transparency frameworks and reporting, but because we are a direct interface with a lot of large and small tech companies, and because we do provide tooling that in some instances can help big tech and small tech surface, review, and in some cases remove content, we need to hold ourselves to an equally high standard. So all the criticisms for tech companies, all the concerns about over censorship or under censorship or moderation online, it's something that we're really in the crosshairs of. So what I'd love to do is just share a few slides. Visuals kind of help in this arena if you're not really sure what hash sharing is or what GIFCT is as an interesting form of an NGO. And so I'll talk through it, and I really do welcome many questions because we usually get better by those that maybe disagree or don't understand what we're doing. It forces us to be transparent in the right ways. And so I really hope that this will help. Let's see, where am I sharing? You just tell me when you see a big GIFCT logo. Looks like you can see my emails. Yeah, that's not what we want to be sharing. See, we spoke too soon when we said that the PowerPoints were working well. Let's see now. Do you see a big GIFCT logo? All right. So we're a little bit of a funky NGO because of our origin story. And to start with, we were founded initially not as an NGO, but as an initiative that was jointly run between 4 founding tech companies. So that already is a little bit of a different origin story. We were founded by YouTube, Microsoft, Facebook, and Twitter in 2017. And if you go back, 2017 feels like a long time ago right now, but you can imagine it was really the height of discussion of this new crazy Islamist extremist terrorist group that people were talking about called Daesh or ISIS or the so-called Islamic State. And the difference was that there was this mass proliferation of both centralized and decentralized terrorist content across a multitude of platforms. And it's not something that we had seen at that scale before. When we looked traditionally at terrorist content, it had been quite centralized narratives from Al-Qaeda. There were quite strict regulations. This sort of fanboy, fangirl content and foreign terrorist fighter content, highly decentralized, highly unregulated, hadn't been seen at that scale. And so GIFCT was founded originally off of 3 questions, and all of our programmatic work kind of fit around those 3 questions. One is, where is it even feasible to share tech or technological solutions across different platforms in a way that does not violate human rights or privacy or other concerns? Where can we get better action-oriented research from the research community? So usually research papers take 6 to 12 months, if not more, for bigger research grants. if I give you a question about the tech community on day one, in 3 years' time or even 6 months' time, that question might be obsolete. So we wanted a quicker action feed from experts that had their finger on the pulse of what adversarial shifts were looking like. And then where can we just share better knowledge? And some of that feeds into transparency. Where can law enforcement and government and tech companies and CSOs share some of that open source intelligence, again, in a way that's sensitive to not sharing privacy information or other concerned areas, but where can we just understand this open source intelligence a little better between the sectors? And then the last one really came about in the aftermath of the Christchurch terrorist attacks, which is how do you respond in a real world crisis when there are online aspects at play directly curated by the perpetrator or accomplice during a real world threat. And so in all of these things, there's quite a bit of transparency that's needed, either just for basic information sharing or to ensure that we have oversight so we're not pressing a button or employing a tool that actually ends up over-censoring journalists or activists or at-risk audiences. And so normally organizational structures are not the sexy topic to bring up, but it is important that when we transferred into an independent NGO, which was in the aftermath of the Christchurch call, that we kind of moved ourselves to have a little bit of transparency by design as well. So our founding fathers, the tech companies that founded and fund us, turned into an operating board, but we took on an independent advisory committee that we could disclose more to about our activities, that considered itself really a feedback loop to us that includes both government and non-government bodies. So it includes New Zealand, the US, the UK, France, but also the EU, the UN, Japan, Ghana. And then that is outnumbered by a larger group of civil society, both human rights activists, CVE practitioners, counterterrorism experts, to bring in that different perspective to us. And it does not mean that they have to agree, because if you try to get government, non-government, counterterrorism practitioners and human rights people in a room, it's not the case that they're going to come out with one unified voice, but it does help us as a sounding board to understand where concerns might be across different sectors that have expertise or stakes in the game in this field. And so when we think about what it is to join GIFCT, you might immediately think of some of these tech companies and think, yes, when I think terrorism online, these tech companies come to mind. But there are likely also a number of other companies on our membership roster that you think, I had no idea that they would be exploited by violent extremism and terrorism, and I wonder what that looks like. And so in all of these cases, we need to kind of move our mindset beyond just thinking of social media, or even just thinking of big 3 or 4 companies in social media, recognizing that if all of us are using a multitude of apps, bad actors are exactly the same, and they're using a multitude of apps to get very different things done in their day-to-day coordination, whether that's private conversations versus public amplification, where you store your content, how you operationalize something, where you go to stay, when you travel. These are all things that can be exploited. And so if we're going to bring members in, a lot of what we do is very open and public, but for membership, we do share some of that tooling and some of those behind the scenes conversations and crisis response. And so we also wanted to build in a membership framework that included transparency as one of its 6 pillars. You don't have to read every word on this slide, but we wanted to ensure that if a company comes to the table with us, that there is some basics, that their terms of service, again, to transparency point, their terms of service explicitly give public wording to allow the public to know that they prohibit terrorist and or violent extremist activity. That also they're able to receive and review and act on reports. So there are actually quite a few sites that you go on that you think, well, if I saw bad actor behavior, like certain gaming sites, for example, how would I even flag that to a platform? And so for the bigger platforms, we take advantage of the fact that we can flag things, but not all services have that. Some of these are aspirational, like the desire to explore new tech solutions. You probably wouldn't be joining GIFCT if that wasn't on your agenda. Same thing with support for expanding capacities of civil society that we work with. But we include a regular public data transparency report and a public commitment to respecting human rights. These two can be very tricky for either smaller companies that are just new to coming to the table, or even bigger companies that had not really come to counterterrorism as a security risk previously. A transparency report for tech companies is a big lift. It includes a lot of legal oversight. It also means once you put one out, you're expected to do at least the same as that every year thereafter. And so usually what happens is when somebody comes to apply for GIFCT, they fill out around these 6 areas. And we work very closely with Tech Against Terrorism, which is a fantastic NGO we partner with that has a mentorship program. And so we actually pass over and fund Tech Against Terrorism to take companies through individually and work with them to get up to scratch on all 6 of these points. And it's really important because a lot of time and energy gets put into that process. And even if a company never gets to full membership, but gets better terms of service and starts with a transparency report, it's already kind of bettered the ecosystem for us to all understand and be able to interface with how a tech company is doing in this space. Now, when we talk about what GIFCT does, so it's kind of a, what do the tech companies that are members do on transparency, and then what does GIFCT do? All of our programmatic efforts kind of fall into 3 pillars. Where is this about prevention? And prevention looks a little different for a tech company versus a CSO. The PVE/CVE space is a little different to a tech solution for preventing viral spread, which I'll talk about. Where is it about response? So where are we responding to a real world threat that has online implications? And then where is it about learning? So that feedback loop, so that you don't let a crisis go to waste, you learn from it, you build from it, and you understand what to do next. And building on some of this, I would say that last year, GIFCT underwent a very lengthy and very comprehensive human rights impact assessment with a group called BSR. This is something that we thought we should do proactively instead of reactively. It's something that our independent advisory committee was very supportive of. And this is something that we have publicly on our website, and I can definitely share links afterwards. You can go and read the full thing as well as our executive director giving a response. But some of the immediate was to break down just, I only included some of the bullet points about accountability, governance, accountability, and transparency. Some of this was to have better transparency about how our operating board and our independent advisory committee were interfacing with each other and with us. So that's really good actionable feedback. There were also some longer term goals around really looking at some of the multi-stakeholderism that we've established, different processes about how the hash sharing database works. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And these are really hard. These are really hard things, especially when you come to tech solutions, because we don't have a lot to go off of. So I would say that even for NECMEC, even on child exploitation, where they've been doing hash sharing, which is, again, the storing of digital fingerprints that correspond to images and videos, there are not a lot of transparent aspects that we can look to and say, okay, this is how this sector did it, let's go forward. So we have found that we're really at the forefront of trying to push ourselves, but really don't have a lot of guidance from other sectors of how to do this. And then also, how do we interface with our member companies and maybe force them to be a little bit more transparent about how they interface with any of the tooling that we provide. So on Prevent, I've been saying hash and hash sharing, and some of you on the call might know what that is. Others might be absolutely clueless. It is basically a way where we do not store source content. We do not want to source, as an NGO, personally identifiable information, but you can take images and videos. And now we've actually built out the capacity to also take PDFs and URLs, and you hash them. So in essence, you make a digital fingerprint. So it becomes a numeric value. So we just source these hashes. And then if you have an API with our database, when you apply it to your database of content, it would proactively surface, if you wanted it to, any matches against that hashed version of a content. So it literally is like using a fingerprint to find the actor it corresponds to. And so from 2017 onwards, we've been building out this database of hashes. Question number 1 is always, how do you define terrorism? And having taught at university, you can debate this for years and never have a total answer. But we started, when we have this bigger group of companies, we started with the UN designated entities list. That is where most companies find common ground. On top of that, when we have a content incident protocol, so when there's a live streamed attack and assets during a real world threat, we give that its own label. And so that is what happened. The first instance of that was with the Christchurch terrorist attack, but subsequently that's happened in Glendale, Arizona and Halle, Germany. And then we really went through a big process, a transparent and open process with a bunch of global academics around how we could expand that taxonomy. The UN list is quite biased, as is any list. The UN is one of the best of the bunch, but it is quite biased towards Islamist extremist terrorism. And a lot of criticism was around ensuring that we could get to some of the white supremacy and neo-Nazi terrorism, but in other parts of the world that might be Hindu extremism, Buddhist extremism, there's lots of forms. So we have expanded to include hashed URLs from a terrorist content analytics platform that Tech Against Terrorism runs. So that includes the Five Eyes lists, which includes some white supremacy groups. It also includes a bucket for attacker manifestos. So regardless of what group you belong to, if you distribute a manifesto and carry out an attack, we can bucket that. And then branded PDF content, which allows us to get to a lot of the Islamist extremist branded content, but also potentially things like siege, so some of the white supremacy content. And if you look at our transparency report this year from last year, it's about 3 times longer. And that's because of a lot of feedback we had from a transparency working group that was really nitpicky and really helpful about saying, here's where we think we need more information to understand how this operates. This is definitely the biggest point of contention of hash sharing, of trying to get a feedback loop. And we're not all the way there. We still want to do more transparently about it. But this will be one of the main ones that people have question on about how it operates and what's in it. On incident response, again, I mentioned that if we have these different criterias for a real world threat that has online implications, it allows us to potentially, at the worst case scenario, label an event and hash specific content. What I would say about this is anytime we trigger a content incident or an incident protocol, we try to communicate directly during the crisis with the government and law enforcement that it's relevant to. And in the aftermath of that, we also will post a blog post about it and some of the data about the incident. I want to be very clear that there are wider harms that touch on incidents, but we only are focused on the perpetrator or accomplice related online activities. So this is not for us about bystander footage, which I know is a bigger harms discussion. This is really about the perpetrator or accomplice related online activities. And then again, on the learn aspect, any of the academic work that we want to fund. And so we do fund the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. And it's fantastic. If you've never gone on the website, we want all of that to be as public as possible. And so while we might have refined taxonomies for what could be hashed in that side of the spectrum, we want huge debate about what violent extremism and terrorism looks like around the world and what sort of digital platforms are being exploited and how. And so there's an entire network. There's over 200 different insights that are these shorter form blogs. There's some longer research papers. And this allows for us to have a much bigger, broader conversation and share a lot of quick fire, easy conversation with tech companies in particular. So our main goal is that. And then I'll just kind of end by saying, you know, we do quite a lot of e-learnings and dialogues around the world, much more outside of a pandemic with Tech Against Terrorism as partners. And we do e-learnings once a month to try to bring some of these questions to the fore. But lastly, we do try to also make things transparent about our member companies. So there's lots of questions, for example, about member companies' transparency reports or their safety hubs or what they do for reporting mechanisms. And we've compiled all the URL links to any of our member companies in a member resource guide on our website. And so you can easily click through and compare and see everyone's transparency reports as they go. And then last slide is just, we do have topical working groups that we refresh once a year. And one of them is completely on transparency practices, both for GIFCT and its member companies. And so this really helps us proactively get to a better place as we develop out what it means to be this funky type of NGO that's interfacing with big and small tech and trying to counter terrorism, and really try to set a standard, because the standards really aren't out there for groups like us. And so we hope that other harms areas are kind of maybe taking one from our books as well and learning from where we got it right or wrong in the beginning and evolving with us. I think I'll stop there.
Great, Erin, that was excellent. Thank you so much for that sort of fascinating and important presentation. And and also for being willing to make this presentation at 7 a.m. in the morning. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions in relation to your presentation, but we'll hold those until after our next presentation. So I'd like to introduce Lydia Khalil now. Of course, Lydia needs no introduction to us, but in this presentation, she's wearing her Lowy Institute hat. Lydia's presentation is the state of the tech industry, research, community engagement, and collaboration. And over to you, Lydia.
Thank you, John. Are you able to see my slides or not yet?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you very much. As John said, a lot of you, especially over these past couple of days, have gotten to know me as your trusty AVERT coordinator, but I also wear another hat as a research fellow at the Lowy Institute. And there I'm responsible for coordinating the GNet effort of which the Lowy Institute is a part. And so this research project on a survey of extremism and terrorism experts on what they believe to be the role of technology is in violent extremism, and also on the state of the research community and tech industry engagement was done through this GNet effort. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what GNet is at first. And, for full background and transparency, the Global Network on Extremism Technology is actually a research arm of the GIFCT, of where Erin works. And also, again, Erin mentioned that there's a transparency working group on GIFCT, and I'm a member on that group as well, just so we get kind of relationships clear and out of the way in the beginning. So this Global Network on Extremism and Technology, it's an academic research initiative that's funded and backed by the GIFCT. And it's convened by the International Center for the Study of Radicalization out of King's College in London, but it also has a number of core partners, of which the Lowy Institute is one, based here in Australia. And what that core partnership essentially means is that we manage a number of workshops, we do some smaller reports, and then we do one big report in the year. And last year, this was our big report for GNet based on this survey. And so this survey sought to answer a couple of questions. What does the evidence-based research say about the role of computer-mediated communications and extremism, and what the level and state of engagement between the tech industry and the research community is? So those are two very broad questions, obviously. And these are such broad questions because they have a number of sub-questions around them, such as what role does the internet, including social media, although the internet is much bigger than social media, play in the radicalization process? Has the use of social media increased the production and exposure to violent extremist content? Does this exposure radicalize individuals to violence? Does the use of computer-mediated communications and social media platforms make it easier to recruit or mobilize? So a whole bunch of different sub questions, and all of these questions are by no means exhaustive or new. Since extremist actors have been some of the earliest adopters of the internet, they've recognized its potential as a communication and mobilization tool. And researchers have been grappling with these and similar questions around the role of technology and extremism for quite a long time. We had our keynote speaker this morning, Maura Conway, discuss what terrorism studies can learn from internet studies. But before she even gave us that, large research agenda, she gave us one previous to that a few years ago around 6 key questions around research. And so a lot of these questions are very similar from that. And there are, of course, many other researchers who have asked these and similar ones. So in order to answer these questions, we decided to conduct an expert survey. But I guess you can also ask, why a survey? Why did we choose that methodological approach to try to answer these questions versus, say, a literature review of the available research? And indeed, there's actually been a number of high quality literature reviews on the role of the internet and technology on radicalization and violent extremism over the years. There have been systematic reviews that have been really important to understanding the state of the field and the research community's assessment of the role of the internet and their involvement in violent extremism. However, when we started reading the lit reviews, we found that a lot of them noted that the literature skewed toward the study of jihadist actors because the prevalence of research in that area tended to concentrate on jihadism. And they tended to focus less on other ideologies, particularly right-wing ideologies that are now starting to present, or we're starting to pay attention to the threat that they're presenting across jurisdictions globally. And so there's been an increasing number of emerging research papers that actually haven't yet been included in lit reviews. And the lit reviews were also conducted prior to the pandemic with kind of its full impact on society and extremism yet to be examined. And additionally, one of the most important things that we found from the lit reviews was that the literature, they came to the conclusion that the literature was only as good as the data that it rested upon. And a literature review is less able to adequately illuminate issues around researcher access to data, which then impacts the type and quality of the literature that's being reviewed. And then access to that data depends, at least to some degree, on the level of engagement with industry. So to complement these past lit reviews on internet technology and extremism, and to gain a current understanding of the research community's findings that may not be included in previous lit reviews, we decided to do this surveys. And so before we get to that, sorry. So I compiled a database of researchers for a number of sources. The editorial boards of prominent journals in the field of terrorism and extremism studies. The database also drew on GNet Associate Fellows and GNet Insight contributors whose work focused on the internet and extremism, and other experts who are part of kind of recognized research institutes and networks that focused on extremism and terrorism, and were identified as well and added to the database. We made sure to try to include established researchers, early career researchers, and those focusing specifically on terrorism and technology. And those were identified by looking at various research conference programs. So the questions that were in the survey were deliberately worded so that we didn't solicit kind of an opinion or an impression, but to have respondents base their answers on empirically based research that they either conducted themselves or have read or used in their work. And so it was a rather large survey. It was 44 questions. And I'll just preview a few of the findings now. The first set of findings related to how experts viewed the role of technology. And when we asked, based on empirically based research that you've conducted or have come across, do you observe that the internet enabled communication and online activities in extremism? And has their use made it easier to recruit individuals into extremist movements? And the overwhelming answer around that fell into the yes category. They found that it has been the online environment had supported, encouraged, and mobilized real world harm. And we asked the question too that, did it satisfy a desire for action and participation in extremism versus virtual activity alone, or both? And the majority of respondents said either it did support, encourage, or mobilize real world harm, or both. And very few respondents actually saying that strictly online activity dissatisfied a desire for action. It was like less than 1%. And that's interesting to note, that the majority of those canvass concluded that online activity leads to real world harms, particularly as some research has shown that some individuals just restrict themselves only to online activity and pose no offline risk because that their online activity has kind of satisfied their desire for action. And we heard earlier today in a panel with Dr. Horgan and Professor Horgan and Professor Grossman that, a lot of, on recruitment, that a lot of people, the vast majority of people who have extremist views are not going to be involved in violent action. And so that was kind of an interesting, kind of finding and counterpoint to that. And similarly, the findings, the question around recruitment, whether the internet enabled communications made it easier to recruit individuals to extremist movements, there was broad agreement that it had. 90% of responses agreed or strongly agreed on that. And likewise, when we asked if the internet made it easier to plan attacks or mobilize violence, the majority of respondents, 84% agreed or strongly agreed. However, many of the respondents caveated their answers by saying that while the internet, particularly encrypted communications, made it easier to mobilize, detailed attack planning actually often occurred offline, particularly for sophisticated plots. And when we dug a bit deeper and we asked more specifically if exposure and engagement with extremist content leads to offline harm, the responses were less decisive, which meant that exposure to content alone didn't necessarily mean it was going to lead to offline harm, which echoed what Lit Reviews had said, that engaging with extremist content can be a contributing factor, but it is not causal or determinative or sufficient. According to one respondent, there are a lot of predisposing factors before any interaction with extremist content can lead to offline actions, and the causal pathway is not going to be discernible. However, this may be because, as a majority of respondents also indicate, the research was inconclusive. We don't have enough evidence on this, simply don't have enough data. Research uses very limited data, very minimal empirical research that clearly shows a connection. So all of these were the comment responses to that. So clearly there's an issue around the data that researchers are able to access to actually answer this question. And additionally, when we asked about how certain individuals accessed or were exposed to extremist content, specifically through algorithmic recommendation functions of social media platforms, respondents agreed that algorithmic recommendation played an important role in amplifying content. 62% agreed or strongly agreed, but were more circumspect about whether it played a part in an individual's path toward radicalization, popularly termed, going down the rabbit hole. And many pointed to the fact that research was inconclusive and that there's insufficient research on how algorithmic recommendation factors into the radicalization process. Much of the research in extremist content and algorithmic recommendation focuses on YouTube. And one respondent who indicated that they actually had done research in this area found that algorithmic recommendation algorithms are a key driver for recruitment, radicalization, and propaganda. And another stated that there's strong evidence to suggest that recommender algorithms, at the very least, can cause desensitization, to which in turn can lower a viewer's inhibition to violence. And so the research posits that this immersive nature of social media, including its recommender algorithms, can alter the viewer's perception of reality and can often result in creating a sense of imminence, resulting in a feeling that action must be taken immediately. Next, we talked about content moderation. And when respondents were asked about whether content moderation or removing or suppressing extremist content was an effective means of countering terrorism and extremism and reducing real world harm, of those that were aware of this research kind of fell in two positions. So it was not inconclusive. So some agreed or strongly agreed, 48%, or about 37% said that that the research was inconclusive. But many of the respondents did agree that it was an effective means of countering extremism and reducing real world harm. And those that did noted that content moderation obviously was only one means of intervention. It's only one piece in a puzzle. However, almost half of them, of their survey respondents, did find that content moderation affected them and it impacted their ability to access data and conduct research on their desired topics around extremism. 34% neither agreed or disagreed, suggesting that it wasn't part of their research. And some respondents said that content moderation has led to a change in research focus, that content had been blocked or removed or made inaccessible, can't be studied. Which is an obvious but important point. And respondents made the point that there needed to be a more systematic archiving of extremist content and accounts that aided research. And there's a lot more in the report about respondents' evidence-based views on deplatforming, which I won't have time to get into right now, but it can be found in the report. But the comments kind of coalesced around two broad themes. It's a useful tool and it limits audience reach of extremist actors, particularly influencers. But it's one part of a larger puzzle. However, deplatforming can also play into grievances and push extremist actors into unmoderated or niche, sometimes encrypted platforms where they can continue to engage. So that was kind of an overview of the first part of the survey. The second part really delved into their engagement, researchers' engagement with the tech industry. And we thought it was important to look into this, for the reasons outlined around the limitations of a lit review, but also because much of the data that we're trying to use to help us answer these questions lies with industry. And research access to this data, industry stakeholders and their level of engagement with industry impacts how well we can answer these questions. And so we sought to gain some insight into if and how researchers have engaged with the tech sector where much of this data is held. And when we asked what type and level of engagement that they've had with tech companies, the answers varied widely. There was no clear pattern at all. So responses ran the spectrum from working closely with tech companies, co-producing research, briefing them on research updates, to absolutely no engagement at all. But much of that engagement was through GIFCT or via academic conferences. And there was also a number of researchers that indicated a kind of cynicism around engagement with tech companies, in that, tech companies don't engage, they just make it look like they're addressing problems or look like they're engaging when they're actually not really. They noted that industry was very keen to see research, but they were less forthcoming in providing insights into what their platforms are doing. So it was clearly not a two-way relationship at all. And here we're making some broad generalizations. Obviously, it depends on the company, as Erin mentioned in her presentation too, but we're just kind of giving a broad impression of the industry overall. So I'll go very quickly with the remaining time that I have in terms of talking about what motivated researchers to engage with industry if they had. And obviously, this is no surprise to anyone, it was access to data. But interestingly enough, when researchers were asked if they had approached a company to obtain data to inform their research, 75% said no. And those who did ask, the majority weren't able to access that said data. So some respondents who indicated they initially did not ask social media companies for the data, either they understood that the company's policies didn't allow for it, or they didn't have the appropriate tech company, the channels to, appropriate representatives in a particular company. And we all know what the terms of services are around a lot of these companies. And so that's obviously a barrier to data sharing for them. But according to a comment from one respondent, the process to inquire about any of this is highly opaque. And many other respondents commented that they were unsure what opportunities for engagement even were, or who to contact, or simply that engagement just wasn't a priority with them. And so that inability to kind of engage and to access data and engagement more broadly with the tech industry was one of the limitations to their research. But it wasn't the only one. Academics also have to go through ethics approval processes and considerations, legislation, privacy considerations, all of these things that impact our access to data to answer some of these key questions around the role of technology. And so as a result, researchers have been, relying on secondary data, although it has been changing, as we've seen from a lot of the key presentations that we've seen today. So sorry, I forgot to do these slides, but this was basically the stats on that question about if you were able to access data, did you ask, and all of these things. And so we found that it's a potentially fruitful, but obviously fraught space so far. And I'll just conclude here with some limitations about this survey approach to it. So obviously it's a non-random sample. It only represents the views of those who responded to the questionnaire. They, aside from the kind of criteria I described for building the database of potential respondents and experts, we didn't devise any further method to determine an individual's level of engagement with the issues around technology and extremism. Many of the respondents chose to remain anonymous, so we actually couldn't verify their level of research expertise involved in answering these survey questions. And additionally, it's very well the case that researchers and experts who have relevant expertise around these issues may not have responded to the survey. A majority of the respondents also were listed in North America, and so that was where the geographic research focus also skewed. And there's definitely further refinement needed to the survey approach. If I had to do it all over again, these are really complicated questions. This was kind of like the first iteration of this one. There's a lot of the questions were comparative in nature, and as so many of the respondents pointed out, there is not a lot of comparative research that compares the pre and post internet environment. And so that's a gap in the research. It's one that's very difficult to fill. I'd like to continue refining and workshopping this survey because I think it's important to get expert views on this. And there's obviously a lot to be refined in it. And it was it was a good learning experience kind of going through this the first time around. Devising good surveys is extremely difficult, particularly around complex questions. So I'll just conclude by saying, the report is available, on the Lowy Institute website if you'd like to take a look at it. I'd welcome any kind of feedback on the survey questions and their design if you'd like to be in touch. And thank you again.
Oh, well, Lydia, thank you very much. That was terrific. And again, very interesting and very relevant to our earlier presentation as well. And I think you talked about how it sort of engagement in the tech space is fraught and I imagine quite contested. And I was really struck by Erin's kind of statement that or presenting the challenge that we need to move our mindset beyond social media platforms. Certainly a much more sort of complex world than I had imagined before you both provided these presentations. So we now have an opportunity to sort of dig a bit deeper and ask you some more questions. I was thinking I might start with Erin. Erin, clearly, one of the challenges in this space is definitional, and I think you've already said how difficult it is to define sort of what's in and what's out when it comes, well, let alone define what violent extremism is. How does GIFCT sort of gain some kind of measure of consensus from tech companies about where the boundaries are behaviorally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was at a conference in Cologne. What a luxury to travel, but I was in a conference in Cologne a couple of weeks ago, and a researcher was talking about how they tracked something like 109 distinct definitions of terrorism, and roughly it was a combination of 22 different aspects of the definition. And like only 83% had the reference to violence or force, but that was the highest bit of convening between them. So it's completely all over the place if you try to think that you're going to create the one definition to rule them all, and we're an NGO and we've done better than the UN and we figured it out. So I think that what we need to kind of look at for the definitional framework again is that in discussions and in bringing in expert voices, we need to have the least constraints possible for defining terrorism and violent extremism. We need to allow voices from Australia, Singapore, France, wherever in the world to come forward and say, this is how it's manifesting and this is what it looks like in our part of the world, or these are the trends that we are seeing transnationally and cross-platform. You need that, because if you have restricted definitions for the dialogue, then you'll never see the adversarial shifts. But when we come to the tooling, there is a lot of fear. The tools will always help you get to scale and speed. So humans help you get to nuance and adversarial shifts, but tools can help you get to scale and speed. And that will be the case going forward. So more tech does not mean less people are needed at tech companies. None of these tech companies are hiring less people. They're all expanding, which means we're not going to algorithm humans out of the equation. But for the definition side, I think it's important to say that we can look at it in two ways. We can take a list-based approach. The UN list, people are not going to really, there are aspects you could argue in the UN list, I would say. If anyone wants to do bedtime reading and argue me on the UN list, we could do that. But largely, that's probably the most agreement you're going to find comparatively to a nation state list, which has a lot of national biases attributed to it. Or you can take a behavioral based approach. So a content specific behavior based approach. So the UN is our list based approach, but we can also say off of that list, for example, during a crisis, when you have an attacker that is attacking a mosque and shooting, there is not time to say, did they brandish a logo? Did they say, were they holding a flag? Can you see what affiliation they are? Like, you do not have time. The behavior is this person is carrying out an attack. And based on that behavior, if there's a live stream or a manifesto, or in the Halle, Germany attack, there was a PDF that was shared of how to 3D print a gun. So there's different types of online assets that could be at play. You do not question the logo or if they're on a UN list. You hash it based on a terrorist or violent extremist behavior. Now, there are some really wonky cases out there, like the Las Vegas shooting. If that had been live streamed, we still don't know the motivation behind that attack, but it would have still been the right thing to do if there had been a live stream to hash that sort of thing. So things like attacker manifestos, live streams of an attack, we make our definition not based on affiliation, but based on behavior. And so I think it's either list or behavior, and it has to be very refined. So that's kind of the two sides of the spectrum of definition. Yeah,
no, that's really interesting. I guess a really sort of complex sort of area in terms of behavioral boundaries is when, you know, I guess well-known sort of thought leaders or even, you know, state representatives and leaders are expressing sort of views and behaving in ways that are pushing against that boundary.
Yeah, I mean, my last week at Facebook, having formerly been the Facebook's head of counterterrorism and dangerous organizations for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, I thought it would be a very calm January week that I left Facebook and became full-time at GIFCT, and that is the week that Trump got kicked off the platform. It was not a very relaxing final week. Nobody wants to, I will say that no tech companies actually want to be in the position where they have to make a decision on removal of content or profiles of democratically elected officials, or even non-democratically elected officials. It puts the entire platform at risk in a lot of ways, and it sets a precedent that no platform really wants to do. A lot of people are like, that was great, or that was horrible, or nobody wants to be in that situation room discussing the removal of elected officials' content. I will say for GIFCT, we are looking at the violent extremism side. So there's a lot of broad gray extremist side of the spectrum, but we are looking at the groups that are carrying out the violence. And so we rub up against it and we want to question that in the academic sense, but we're kind of sticking in the violent side of the spectrum.
I guess one of the risks for the GIFCT project is that content that is being brought down is actually innocuous. So I'd be interested to know how the hashtag, how the hash database actually sort of checks for false positives.
I mean, that's, I think for transparency's sake, that's probably one of the best questions out there because, for example, if I were to let you into this hash sharing database, if we have a metaphor that you walk into this house and this is my hash sharing database, you would only see numbers because you're turning an image or a video into a numeric value. So I am just seeing numbers unless I have a true positive to match it against. So we don't have the source content. But one thing that we did do, and this was off the back of quite a lot of consultations with CSOs a year or two ago, is the threat exchange team. Threat exchange is the house that houses those hashes, put in a function so that tech companies could mark agreement or disagreement with a given hash. And you could do that in two ways. So you could either say, I don't think this hash is terrorist content, or you could mark it saying it is terrorist content, but I think you put the wrong severity label on it. Now we've left those in for now. And what we're trying to figure out to do is how to test where disagreement is to reaffirm false positive or false negative. But one thing I would say out there is if you do not have a subject matter expert team, a lot of even the most agreed upon terrorist content, so ISIS content, could just be a selfie of a foreign terrorist fighter out in the desert. And if your moderation team does not know that that's a foreign terrorist fighter, you could just think it's a guy in camo pants in a desert scene. And so even for an agreed upon group like ISIS, there's a lot of great content. And so to date, we've kept the hashes in, but we've allowed for the disagreement to be marked on it so that it's a signal to the other tech companies either to downrank the priority, or maybe they don't want to include anything that has disagreement, or they can make different decisions based on that marker of agreement or disagreement.
Great, thank you. One of the questions we have is, as extremists move to other platforms, how will GIFCT remain current?
I mean, and Lydia can jump in too, because I think this is one of the things that we lean in on a lot of experts to help inform us. And so you'll see that there's 18 member companies. So they've gone through the rigor of having these 6 criteria all tied up. There's a much wider network of tech companies that join our e-learning sessions that are possibly pending members. We don't speak and out who pending members are, but there are quite a few in the pipeline. And a lot of our resources are made to be public, like all the GNet insights of which Lydia has contributed to. We get a lot of queries from non-tech members that are other tech companies. We also proactively try to engage in parts of the world where there's burgeoning tech. So the OECD did a report of the top 50 social media companies in the world. I think something like 13 or 15 of those, they are not out of Silicon Valley. They are out of Asia, largely China. And so we're really having to discuss, what does it mean to bring non-Western companies more to the fore? We have Mega based out of New Zealand. We have Just Paste It, which is a Polish company. But I think the future will be a diversification of platform type, like financial technologies, storage technologies, blockchain technologies, archive technologies, but also diversity of where those are coming from. It will be less and less Silicon Valley, and it will be more a diversification of global types of platforms that'll be operationalizing in different ways. And I would say the best place you can do is go to your own phone and just think of the types of apps. I guarantee you, you do not have just one app on your phone. And then we're always so surprised that bad actors use more than one app. We are all choosing every day, where can I do this fastest, cheapest, easiest, more secretly, more publicly? Where do I store it? And all those same decisions are being made by bad actors as well.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I'll say too, in addition to the points that Erin's made, you know, as someone who's kind of engaged with GIFCT and the companies that are involved in it, they're not just concerned about what's happening on their platforms. They're also really up to date on what's happening on other platforms that are not their own, and kind of seeing and keeping track of how particular extremist movements are utilizing other platforms and spreading. And so it's not just, so it's like, while, you know, Erin outlined the member companies, but kind of the remit and the exposure of what's happening online definitely goes beyond that. And the member companies are quite well aware of how other platforms are used and are trying to keep track of it. So, you know, like with the QAnon, for example, it's like it was taken off a lot of these major platforms that were GIFCT members, and it's clearly gone to other avenues and other platforms and spaces. It doesn't mean that those platforms have just all of a sudden ignored what QAnon is doing. They're still keeping track of what that movement is doing elsewhere, how it's leading to offline harms, whether it's you know, leading to additional violence. And then the other point I'd like to pick up on about what Erin had mentioned about other platforms from other areas, you know, obviously the origins of GIFCT were from Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of popular platforms right now like TikTok, you know, that are coming out of China in particular, and there's going to be more of those type of platforms that are not just popular in those countries, right? So platforms that will not only be popular in China, or they won't only be popular in India. And with the China in particular, you know, that gets into a whole thing around, you know, geostrategic competition around technology, what that's going to mean, you know, how much we're going to be able to influence how these indigenous platforms coming out of different, you know, different countries that we might have, I wouldn't say adversarial, but a competitive relationship with. But when a lot of your population is using, you know, indigenous tech out of that country, that's going to be kind of a new challenge coming forward as well. So not an answer, but just a new challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I'm so naive to this field. Sort of one question is you know, what's the role of governments in this space?
Well, I think it was so.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Lydia.
No, go ahead, Erin, please.
I was going to say, I was watching Lydia's stats on some of the Q&A with researchers, and it was interesting to me because some of the same things researchers were saying about tech completely is the same sort of response feedback loop you get around relations with government, which is like, you can give a lot of information as a researcher to a government, you don't always get a lot back. And so some of these feedback loops of who gives what to whom and how reciprocal it is. I will say that, you know, GIFCT was made originally really by tech for tech. but with multi-stakeholderism built in by design, because without it, you just don't get impacted solutions. And so, governments aren't GIFCT members, but they are completely embedded within our independent advisory committee, as well as across our working groups. And when we did a reformatting of working groups, we have 5 topical working groups and tons of people applied. And we have about 175 working group participants from 35 different countries. So we really, across all the continents except Antarctica. So if you know any violent extremist or terrorist experts out of Antarctica, bring them my way so I can fill in that, tick that box. But a lot of different governments, increasingly non-Western governments as well, kind of as in those working groups. And I think that's going to be important, especially for some of the conversations around legislation. So right now, especially if you are a smaller tech company that does not have 10,000 lawyers at your beck and call, like a Facebook, where I always had a lawyer in the room in meetings that I could carry out and be like, oh, well, there's another lawyer. I didn't even know where this lawyer came from. But for smaller tech, you are now seeing legislation coming out of different countries that is starting to contradict itself. Not on purpose, all for the best intentions, but post-Cambridge Analytica, you see big pushes for privacy. Post-Christchurch, you see big pushes for security. Then you also have Western democracies pushing for free speech. Free speech, privacy, and security start contradicting each other. And so people are solving with all the best intentions, but you're starting to see legislation that's clashing. And a big question in the future that we need governments in the room for is, okay, well, this legislation says we have to disclose, this legislation says we can't disclose. How are you supposed to solve when different nation states and regional bodies are not aligned and the platforms do not work on nation state boundaries? A piece of content could be sourced from Australia, but someone in France is sharing it with somebody in China. What's the jurisdiction? And that's going to be the next question of why we really need continued dialogues. And really the GIFCT was spawned from a lot of dialogues through the EU Internet Forum. We're definitely embedded within a lot of the work of the Christchurch call to action, working closely with New Zealand and France and others. And so we want to see ourselves as kind of, there's a puzzle piece. We are a train within the train cars, and we want to slot in well. We do not take or replace the role of government, but we want to be compatible with some of these other processes and forums and voluntary actions.
Yeah, no, really interesting, and obviously a great sort of model of multi-sector engagement. Lydia, I think you were going to respond as well.
Yeah, just quickly, because I know that, we're running out of time, but, Erin made some great points. And, she also made that point in her presentation that like none of these tech companies want to be making decisions like on, especially elected leaders using how they can use their platform. And so while a lot of these tech companies have been criticized and rightly in my mind about kind of, moving too fast and breaking the things in the room, there is a lot of responsibility that's placed on government that they haven't lived up to, right? So there's been a lot of push and criticism for the tech companies to do better and do this, but they need to have legislative frameworks in order to do that. And like Erin mentioned, there's been some inconsistency around it. And again, a lot of the legislation has focused on content and privacy, and less so on the structure of the companies. And here I'm thinking about antitrust regulation on the scale of these companies. Once, like Facebook is a prime example, it's once a company gets so big to that scale, how do you regulate it? How do we have any expectation at all that they can adequately moderate content in any way, shape, or form? And so legislation kind of has different different aspects to it. And I think we focus much too much on the kind of the content issues around legislation and less so on these other ones. And then the last point I'd make around it too is kind of maybe just offer from the Australian context. Australia is causing a lot of headaches in this space, I think, for tech companies around e-safety legislation, privacy legislation. There are recent court cases that have come out that said, a person is liable for the comments under their posts. And so what does that mean? I mean, those are some things that are coming out of Australia that I think are ahead of some, other jurisdictions and are going to have implications, I think, for tech companies, large and small. And like Erin mentioned, it is the smaller tech companies that I think that will struggle with this. I mean, frankly, the bigger tech companies have been pushing for legislation because it's to their advantage, both economically and otherwise. It takes a heat off of them politically, and it's these kind of medium to smaller size tech companies that are going to kind of flounder in the space.
Yeah, great. Well, look, I think that brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank you so much for the sort of the time, effort and expertise that you've given to this really important topic. And thank you, Erin, also for getting up so early and speaking to us down here in Australia. It's been a really valuable session. So thank you both. The next session, Navigating Terrorist Use of Online Platforms, will begin at 7 p.m, which is now, and will be chaired by Lisa Waldeck. But as usual, there's going to be a brief pause as this session stops recording and as the next session opens up. So thank you all.
Thank you.